The tragedy of Ronald Reagan's life when he married Jane Wyman. The year was 1949. Jane Wyman walked onto the stage at the Academy Awards and accepted the Oscar for Best Actress. The entire industry stood and applauded. She smiled. She looked flawless. She said exactly the right words into the microphone. Her husband was not in that room. He found out she won the same way he found out she was divorcing him, by reading the newspaper. She had called the press before she called him. Ronald Reagan sat with the paper in his hands and did not say a word to anyone. A few months earlier, the two of them had buried their newborn daughter, a baby girl named Christine, who lived for exactly 1 day. Reagan had wanted to grieve together. Jane Wyman responded by sealing her ears shut with wax, stopping speaking entirely, and disappearing into rehearsals for the film that would win her that Oscar. For months, she refused to talk inside their own home. She communicated only in sign language, even with her husband, even while he was still trying to process the death of their child. When she finally spoke in public about why the marriage ended, she stood in a courtroom and blamed his politics. Reagan never corrected the record, not once. Not in any interview, not in any public statement, not in the memoir he eventually wrote about his entire life. That memoir runs to hundreds of pages. He covered his childhood, his film career, his time as governor, his presidency, the assassination attempt, the Cold War, his first marriage, 10 years, 2 surviving children, a daughter in the ground, got 2 sentences. Then he moved on. For the next 56 years, Jane Wyman did not speak his name in a single interview. When reporters brought him up, she left the room. When publishers offered her serious money for a tell-all account, she turned every offer down. The world assumed it was pride. But look at what this woman actually did. She targeted a man with a better studio contract than hers, and married him within 2 years of meeting him. When his career began to stall, and hers began to climb, she stopped pretending the marriage worked. She filed for divorce in the same year she won the Oscar, the moment she no longer needed what he could offer her. She walked into a courtroom and blamed his personality for the collapse of a marriage she had engineered from the beginning. She sent her children to boarding school and went back to work. So, here's the question nobody has ever asked directly. Was any of it real? The love she performed for the cameras, was that a role, the same as every other role she played? When she swallowed those and left that on the kitchen counter, was she genuinely desperate? Or was she a woman who already understood at 21 years old exactly how much leverage a man's guilt could buy her? Was Ronald Reagan a husband to her? Or was he a transaction? A contract she signed when it was useful and terminated the moment it stopped paying out? And if the answer is that she used him, then what does it mean that she kept his marriage certificate in her bedroom until the day she died? What does it mean that she was secretly funding his campaigns while publicly pretending he did not exist? What kind of person does both of those things at the same time? That is what we are going to find out. Who Jane Wyman was before any of this started, where she actually came from, and why a woman with that particular history learns to treat people the way she treated him. What happened inside that marriage that the courtroom record and the studio press releases never captured, and whether what looks like cold calculation from the outside might have had something else running underneath it the entire time. The answers are not simple, but they are all here. Where she came from. To understand what Wyman did to Ronald Reagan, you have to understand what the world did to Jane Wyman first. She was born Sarah Jane Mayfield in 1917 in St. Joseph, Missouri. Her father died when she was 4 years old. Her mother, unable or unwilling to raise her alone, handed her to the neighbors down the street and walked away. A couple named the Folks took her in. They eventually adopted her legally and gave her their name. She was renamed. Her original family was erased from the record. She grew up in a house that was not hers, with a name that was not hers, in a life that had been arranged for her by the departure of two people who were supposed to stay. By the time she was a teenager, she had already learned the core lesson that would govern everything she did for the rest of her life. People leave. So you build yourself in a way that means you will never need them to stay. She moved to Hollywood in the early 1930s, changed her name again, and began the long, grinding work of becoming someone the industry would take seriously. It did not happen quickly. For years, she appeared in films where her name was not even listed in the credits. She was decorative, available, and completely interchangeable with a dozen other young women doing the same work on the same studio lot. She was also watching, carefully, learning how the system worked, who held power inside it, and what it would take to move from the bottom of that system to the top. By 1938, she had a clearer picture of what she needed, and she had just spotted it. The move. Ronald Reagan arrived at Warner Brothers as everything Jane Wyman was not yet. He had a strong leading man contract. The studio liked him. He was being groomed for the kind of roles that made careers. He was also, by every account from people who worked with him at the time, genuinely likable in a way that was impossible to fake. Warm, enthusiastic, easy to be around. The kind of man who made everyone in a room feel like he was glad they were there. They were cast together in a film called Brother Rat in 1938. Reagan was playing the lead. Wyman was in a supporting role. Colleagues who were on that set later described what happened next with a consistency that is hard to dismiss. Reagan was initially pleasant toward her, friendly, professional, nothing more. It was Wyman who accelerated things. It was Wyman who made the relationship happen at a pace that Reagan himself found difficult to keep up with. William Demarest, who worked with both of them during this period, said Reagan had seemed genuinely caught off guard by the speed of her approach. Reagan was not inexperienced with women, but he was not prepared for someone who moved with this kind of deliberate momentum. When he hesitated about marriage, when he slowed down, when he indicated that things might be moving faster than he was comfortable with, Jane Wyman did not adjust her timeline. She swallowed a bottle of pills and left a on the kitchen counter. Reagan found the note, called for help, and sat beside her hospital bed until she recovered. After that, the hesitation stopped. They married on January 26, 1940, at a small church in Glendale, California. Warner Brothers immediately recognized the value of what they had and began promoting them as a couple. Photographs in magazines, interviews presented as windows into their domestic happiness, a carefully maintained image of two talented people who had also managed to build something real together. It was exactly the kind of story the studio system loved to tell. Whether it was the story that was actually happening inside that house is a different question entirely. The years inside. For the first few years, the arrangement worked. Reagan's career was steady. Wyman was working, building momentum, getting better roles. They had a daughter, Maureen, in 1941. They adopted a son, Michael, in 1945. From the outside, the family looked like what the magazines said it was. Then the war ended, and things began to shift in a direction that neither of them had anticipated. Reagan came back from his wartime service with a new focus that had nothing to do with acting. He became absorbed in the politics of the Screen Actors Guild, the union that represented performers across the industry, at exactly the moment when those politics became explosive. The Red Scare was moving through Hollywood like a fire, destroying careers, splitting friendships, turning colleagues into informants. Reagan was elected president of the Guild in 1947 and immediately found himself at the center of one of the ugliest battles the industry had ever seen. He was energized by it. He came home from meetings and talked about it at dinner. He stayed up late, working through strategy. He invited people to the house to discuss what was happening and what needed to be done. The home that Wyman had built as a refuge from the industry was turning into a branch office of it. She did not hide her reaction. People who socialized with them during this period recalled the particular quality of her contempt. Not loud, not explosive, but absolutely clear to anyone paying attention. She had a line she used about him when the subject of his political involvement came up. She said, "Ask Ronnie what time it is, and he will tell you how to build a clock." It was the kind of thing you say about someone you have already stopped respecting. Then, in June of 1947, Jane Wyman gave birth to their third child, a daughter they named Christine. The baby was 4 months premature. She lived for 1 day and was buried without ever coming home. Reagan was devastated. He wanted to sit in the same room as his wife and be in the same grief together. He wanted the shared acknowledgement of what they had both just lost. Wyman responded by sealing her ears with wax. She had been cast as Belinda in the film Johnny Belinda, a young woman who is deaf and mute, and she had decided that the most committed preparation for that role was to remove sound from her own life entirely. She stopped speaking at home. She communicated in sign language. She was present in the house physically, and absent from it in every other way that mattered. Reagan was living with a woman who would not speak to him in the weeks after the death of their child, inside a marriage that was already badly damaged. He did not retaliate publicly. He wrote letters to friends instead, letters that remained private for decades. In one of them, he described his wife as still quite ill in her mind, and said he still hoped things might change. He wrote, "I know she loves me, even if she thinks she doesn't." That sentence, written by a man whose infant daughter had just been buried and whose wife was communicating with him only through hand gestures, is one of the most painful things Ronald Reagan ever put on paper. He was still trying to save it. She was already somewhere else entirely. The Oscar and the Courtroom. Johnny Belinda opened in theaters in 1948. What Jane Wyman did in that film stopped people cold. She played a woman who had been silenced by the world, dismissed, denied, and she did it without speaking a single word for nearly 2 hours. No dialogue. Nothing but her face, her hands, the way she held her body against a world that had decided she did not matter. Critics who had spent years ignoring her sat in darkened theaters and understood for the first time what she was actually capable of. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated her for Best Actress. She won. On the night of the ceremony, she walked to the microphone at the RKO Pantages Theater and accepted the most prestigious award in the film industry. The room applauded. Her career, already ascending, was now at a height that most actors never reach. Ronald Reagan was not there. In that same year, the year she won, Jane Wyman filed for divorce. Reagan read it in the newspaper. She had informed the press before she informed her husband. He sat with the paper and said nothing to anyone. In court, she was measured and precise. Her stated reason for ending the marriage was his obsession with politics, his consuming involvement with the Screen Actors Guild, his inability to be present in the way a husband needed to be. She said it had worn her down. She said she could not continue. She did not mention the months she had refused to speak inside their home. She did not mention Christine. She did not offer any account of the pill bottle and the note that had started the whole thing 9 years earlier. She mentioned his politics, and the court accepted it, and the press repeated it, and it became the official version of events. Reagan corrected nothing. He made one public statement, a single sentence to a reporter, delivered with the particular bitterness of a man who has been publicly misrepresented and knows there is nothing to be done about it. He said, "If divorce is the word, then I suppose I should name Johnny Belinda as co-respondent." After that, silence. He eventually wrote a memoir, hundreds of pages, his entire life documented in careful detail. The chapter covering his first marriage ran to 2 sentences. 2 sentences. For 10 years, 2 surviving children, a buried daughter, and a divorce he read about in print. Patricia Neal, who was close to Reagan during this period, was asked about his state of mind in the months that followed. She was direct. She said he was heartbroken, truly, because he had not wanted the divorce. Jane had. And Jane had gotten what she came for. What she built next. In the years after the divorce, Jane Wyman worked. She was nominated for 3 more Academy Awards. She transitioned into television before almost any other major film star was willing to consider it, not out of desperation, but as a deliberate choice, a recognition that the audience was moving, and she intended to move with them. In 1955, she created her own anthology series and ran it herself, controlling the scripts, choosing the directors, producing content that bore her name in the title. She married twice more. A composer named Fred Karger in 1952. They divorced in 1955, remarried in 1961, divorced again in 1965. Both endings were quiet. In 1953, in the middle of her marriage to Karger, she converted to Roman Catholicism, not publicly, not as a gesture toward respectability, but as a private commitment she carried without announcement. She became a lay tertiary of the Dominican order, binding herself to a daily life of prayer and service. She attended Mass regularly for the rest of her life. No one in the press quite knew what to make of it. The woman who had filed for divorce from one of America's most prominent political figures had become, in private, something close to a lay nun. She did not explain it to anyone. Ronald Reagan, meanwhile, had left acting and entered politics. He became governor of California in 1966. He ran for president in 1976 and came close. He ran again in 1980. Jane Wyman said nothing about any of it. 56 years. When Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States on January 20, 1981, Jane Wyman was starring in the primetime drama Falcon Crest, earning $35,000 per episode, more than his weekly presidential salary. She sent no message to the White House. She appeared at no event. She granted no interview. When reporters tracked her down, and they tried, persistently, for years, her answer was always the same sentence, delivered with a finality that made follow-up questions pointless. It is bad taste to talk about ex-husbands. One sentence, recycled across 3 decades of media pressure, against an industry that was willing to pay enormous sums for something more. Her own children felt the weight of what this silence cost. Michael Reagan, whom Jane and Ronald had adopted together in 1945, wrote about his childhood in a memoir published in 1988. He described being placed in boarding school as a very young child, a school from which the children were collected every 2 weeks on Friday evenings and returned every Sunday night. He wrote that if you stood outside the dormitory after Sunday drop-off, you could hear all of the children crying themselves to sleep. He was 3 years old when his parents divorced. The person who raised him day to day, he wrote, was not his mother. It was his mother's cook, a woman named Carrie, who provided the kind of consistent warmth that the house itself did not. Jane Wyman kept working, kept attending Mass, kept maintaining the wall. And for 56 years, the world watched that wall and concluded it understood what it meant. The world was wrong. What was in her room? Ronald Reagan died on June 5, 2004. He was 93 years old. The funeral lasted 5 days. World leaders attended. Tens of thousands of Americans stood in line to pay their respects as his body lay in state at the Capitol. Nancy Reagan, who had spent a decade watching him disappear into Alzheimer's disease, sat beside him at every stage of it. Jane Wyman appeared at none of it. Not the private service, not the public ceremony, not the burial at his presidential library in Simi Valley. But at the burial, someone noticed a floral arrangement that had not come through any official channel. White flowers placed near the front. No card, no name. No one ever confirmed where it came from. 3 years later, in September of 2007, Jane Wyman died at her home in Palm Springs. She was 90 years old. When the people handling her estate went through the things she kept in her private room, the things no journalist had ever seen, the things she had never shown anyone, they found her marriage certificate from 1940, the original document, folded carefully, kept intact for 67 years, through 4 subsequent decades of public silence, through 2 more marriages, through everything. They found letters, some from him, written during the final months of their marriage, some in her own hand that had never been sent, and they found financial records showing that Jane Wyman had contributed money, quietly, through channels difficult to trace back to her, to Ronald Reagan's political campaigns, while maintaining, in every public forum available to her, the position that he did not exist in her life. The woman who would not say his name had been helping to pay for his path to the White House. At her funeral, Jane Wyman was dressed in the full habit of the Dominican Third Order, the plain brown robe of a lay member of that order. No jewelry, no Hollywood presentation. Her coffin was unvarnished wood, the simplest available. She was buried with the marriage certificate from January 26, 1940. She had kept it longer than she had kept any of her subsequent marriages. She had kept it longer than most people keep anything. She could have destroyed it at any point across 6 decades and chose every single time not to. The answer. So go back to the question the hook raised. Was Ronald Reagan a husband to her or a transaction? Here's what the evidence actually shows. She moved toward him with calculation. She used his guilt to get a ring on her finger. She climbed while he stalled and ended the marriage at the exact moment the Oscar made it unnecessary. She handed him a courtroom narrative that protected her reputation at the direct expense of his. She built a wall of silence so complete that it held for more than half a century against sustained media pressure and serious money. Every one of those things is true. And she kept his certificate. She kept his letters. She funded his campaigns in secret. She sent flowers with no name to his grave and let no one claim it. Every one of those things is also true. The most honest answer is that Jane Wyman was a 4-year-old child who was handed to strangers and learned, in the years that followed, that needing someone was the most dangerous thing a person could do. She built a life on never appearing to need anyone, not the studios, not her audiences, not her husbands, not her children. She was disciplined, brilliant, and capable of extraordinary coldness. She was also, clearly, incapable of letting go of the one person she had most publicly declared she was done with. That is not the story of a woman who used a man and moved on. That is the story of a woman who never found a way to say what she actually meant, and chose instead to fold it into a piece of paper and carry it with her until there was no one left to show it to. Ronald Reagan is remembered as the 40th President of the United States. Jane Wyman is remembered, when she is remembered at all, as the woman who left him. She spent her entire adult life refusing to be defined by that. And it happened anyway. Whether that is justice or tragedy probably depends on what you think she actually felt. Write it in the comments. I want to read what you think.